And now, the
good
nations of the world.
Hungary, Iran, Israel. Israel. Israel.
The
good
nations of the world.
Israel.
So one argument that proponents of race mixing make is that being mixed race means more genetic diversity, which will make you healthier. The mechanism by which this supposedly happens is that you have fewer double expression of deleterious recessive alleles. These are alleles that are rarely expressed and as a result weren't under selective pressure, and so really bad stuff can be in there. The reason your teeth and jaw don't grow out sideways and crooked is because dominant genes that did that got expressed and were selected against. But because recessive alleles weren't selected against, all of these problems that were ironed out on the part of the genome that is dominant can still be there in the recessive parts of the genome. And the more genetically distant you are from the person you're mating with, the less likely you are to have these double expressed recessive alleles. So that's a conceptual reason for why breeding with genetically distant organisms could be beneficial. But there's also a conceptual reason for the opposite, and that's the breakdown of co-adaptive gene complexes. Genes don't evolve in isolation, they evolve in sets. You inherit a package of genes, and this package of genes all works together, synergistically. When you scramble up your genes with someone who evolved a different set of genes, each gene is now acting in a different context, and they may lose their synergy. And since we can conceive of reasons why breeding with genetically distant people would be beneficial or harmful, we can speculate one way or the other, then it's going to come down to the data. And spoiler, there's no real effect. If I were to argue for race mixing, I would bring up the fact that Hispanics live longer than whites as an indicator of better overall vitality. The problem though is that the whiter Hispanics actually live longer than the less European ones, i.e. the ones which are more admixed actually live shorter lives than the ones who are more white. So the most parsimonious explanation here would be a cultural effect that comes from whatever it is Hispanics tend to do, not a genetic effect of being mixed race. In addition, we have data on mixed race populations and life expectancy in Brazil, and they are almost exactly the same as everyone else. And strangely enough, we also have data on mixed race life expectancy in Scotland, and there the mixed race population is actually lower than everyone else. We can also try to factor out cultural effects by looking at birth defect data, and these are birth defects per 1,000. So maybe you could say Hispanics have an edge over whites and Asians, but they have slightly more birth defects than blacks in the US. However, if you look at genetic disorders at birth, Hispanics actually have a higher rate than any other group, having 1.1 times the prevalence of genetic disorders at birth than whites. Though frankly, I don't think there's anything to see here. I think this is all just noise, and that the races and the mixed race Hispanic population all have about the same amount of birth defects and genetic disorders, and that this is just noise in the data. And just as a pinch test for the idea that highly genetically similar populations will be at a health disadvantage, we can see where Iceland ranks in terms of global life expectancy, and we can compare that to where Brazil ranks, for example. On relations, mixed-race couples from a study in Canada are 2.36 times more likely to have an assault event than same-race non-white couples. So this effect is not simply a non-white versus white thing. This is mixed-race compared to same-race non-white couples and same-race white couples. They're also 2.6 times more likely to report abuse at a prior time within their marriage than same-race non-white couples. Within this study, the mixed marriages actually had a higher socioeconomic status and more years of school than the same race couples did. So these effects are very, very unlikely to be a result of socioeconomic confounders. If anything, the real world gap is probably larger than this, given that the mixed race couples were actually higher on the socioeconomic status scale, not lower. Also, according to the CDC, being mixed race is the second highest thing that increases the risk that a marriage will end in divorce, beaten out only by one of the partners having an anxiety disorder. In terms of IQ, The overwhelming bulk of evidence shows that mixed race populations fall intermediate between the two races they are composed of. If you want to read more about this, I would recommend my articles on this where I talk about the studies, and there are many of them. So if you want them further explained, click on the relevant links in the description. There are 2 articles I have on mixed population IQ. So we have the famous or infamous Minnesota transracial adoption study showing an intermediate score. Owen, in 1992, going to South Africa, found the coloreds having a matrices score intermediate between whites and blacks. Codwell, as far as 1947, found this result. Rowe in 2002, Fernandez in 2001, Klassen in 1990, Rushton in 2007, Udry in 2003. Some studies that argue against this would be Moore from 1986, which showed mulattoes scoring lower than blacks. Problem is that the sample size was 9 and 14, respectively, and the average age at taking the test was 6. Tizard in 1974 also purportedly showed mixed race individuals scoring the highest, followed by blacks and then whites last. Now, these were in Caribbean orphanages, and the ages of the children tested were between 3 and 4.5. Both of those facts call the relevance of Tizard's study into question, as well as the low sample size. And lastly, Eifforth is brought up a lot, and I have a big write-up on my site about Eifforth. But the simplest way to respond to Eifforth is factoring in the sample and the fact that the test takers were around 11 and at younger ages when IQ is less heritable and the gaps tend to be smaller when people are younger. The results of Eifforth almost perfectly line up with hereditarian predictions in everything but the white female category here. That if you take either James Flynn or Arthur Jensen's heritability scales and what they estimate the black-white IQ gap is at various ages, these perfectly line up with what you would predict based on the admixture and based on the black-white IQ gap at various ages. But that's a bit of a digression. We also have NAEP data from 2011, and these have sample sizes in the hundreds of thousands, and this all shows the intermediacy of the mixed race sample. I also did my own analysis looking at standardized test scores in Mexico, in Colombia, and Brazil. In Mexico, districts which were more European had higher progressive matrices scores. The same pattern was found for PISA scores. The same was found for SABRE scores in Colombia. In Brazil, the same thing was found with the more European regions having the highest PISA scores. And after doing this, even I was surprised at just how granular this all is. I expected there to be more overlap between regions, and I didn't expect a signal as small as, say, a 5% increase in the European admixture from one region to another to so reliably predict a higher standardized test score. A paper from Skinner and Hudak in 2016 found significantly more activation around the insula area, an area of the brain associated with anxiety and disgust when looking at mixed-race couples versus same-race couples. The study participants were non-black students, and the pictures used were wedding photos of 50 white man, black woman couples and 50 black man, white woman couples. Unfortunately, I don't know what to compare these results to because I don't know enough about this stuff, and other papers I have read either don't use this method or it's not similar enough the way they present the data for me to make a comparison. This image here, for example, sure looks like a big difference to small-brained me between the mixed race and same-race couples. But this chart here, in average activation differences in nanoamperes, looks like a small difference. But maybe this small difference is functionally very profound, and obviously the apparently big difference here in the area in red is because of some sort of threshold that they're using, that once activation passes a certain threshold, it's displayed here, and maybe it's because once the activation is past a certain threshold, then it's profound. Even though it's a small difference in terms of real psychological or nuministic experience, it's actually a big deal. I don't know for sure. But obviously the authors of this paper think that this is a big difference. Another study that was done for this paper involved the implicit association test and dehumanization. At the end of it, they wrote, quote, "Our findings indicate that interracial couples are implicitly dehumanized relative to both black and white same-race couples. In other words, participants were quicker to associate interracial couples with non-human animals and same-race couples with humans. Overall, the current findings provide evidence that interracial couples elicit disgust and are dehumanized relative to same-race couples." Also, in this study, they used same-race white and same-race black couples. So this is not just a function of blacks being related to animals or blacks being dehumanized. Same race black couples were not dehumanized or were not related to animals on the implicit association test. In a variation of what they did before, they found that when they showed people gross images before doing this comparison, the implicit association between mixed race couples and animals was even stronger, which is evidence that the more easily grossed out you are, the more implicitly disgusted you will be with race mixing. And this is evidenced by the fact that when you're primed for disgust, you find race mixing to be more disgusting than when you are not primed. So we know what morality is. Morality is just feelings, and they're feelings that come from your genes and from conformity to people around you. There's nothing else they could possibly be. Reaching for any kind of objectivity beyond that which was simply proven to work is just mysticism. There's no necessary reason to imagine that morality or any moral system that is perfectly consistent can ever be created. There's no reason to think that. All that we have here is what works and what has come to be. And nowhere in that is there some embedded fact that there's even the potential of a perfectly consistent moral system. So that's all morality is. And 99% of people in the world today are not total libertines with regard to sex and marriage. There are norms against, for example, huge age differences between people being married, and there are norms against huge intellectual differences between people who are married. And you can probably think of many more norms. And the reason for these norms are twofold. First is that they are just intrinsically gross, they just feel wrong. And second, there are practical reasons for why these kind of relations are bad for people. So if race mixing causes people to feel viscerally disgusted and is practically harmful, well, then we should at the very least advise against race mixed marriages in the same way we advise against a 20-year-old marrying a 50-year-old, or against someone with an IQ of 70 marrying someone with an IQ of 130. And we know that in the past there were laws which reflect norms that were opposed to race mixing wherever there was a substantial black population in the old United States. That the normal view of white people in the past was to be against mixed marriages. And this view occurred in the absence of any conditioning. There was no conditioning to try to get whites wherever they went to oppose race mixing or to support laws against race mixing. There wasn't some program. People didn't even go to college. A lot of people weren't even literate. There wasn't this conditioning program to get whites to be opposed to mixed marriages. It just came naturally. Add to this the fact that in spite of overwhelming conditioning today promoting race mixing, white people have an innate, neurologically measurable disgust to mixed black-white couples. And it just pops out at you that disgust with and opposition to race mixing is the biologically default position that has to be grinded out of you. And even when it's grinded out of you to the point where you will say that you're fine with mixed marriages, you're probably not deep down. And there's no reason you should be deep down. It doesn't make any practical sense, and there's no reason that you should be okay with something that makes you intrinsically retch a little bit. Another thing to consider is the gender disparity that results from race mixing laws. Whites actually have it pretty good. They have parity, with white males and females being about equally capable of finding a mate in a mixed race society. But other races, such as East Asians and blacks, have significant gender disparities and will find themselves more likely to be alone in a multiracial society that doesn't have laws preventing race mixing. Now, the predictable response to me saying this is, oh, well, Ryan, you hate black people. Why should we believe you when you say this? You hate Asians. Why? And it's not about me or what my secret motives might be here. If you want to think that I have some bizarre cartoon hatred of brown people for their audacity in choosing to be brown, fine. If you need some figure out there in the world to fill the role of Satan in your mind, whatever. But what I say here is true regardless of what my motives are. The numbers here aren't fake. This is from Pew, and it's linked in the description as always. Because the races evolved their own particular traits in their own particular evolutionary context. And part of that context was each other. Males and females evolved to be attracted to males and females of their own race. And when you introduce males or females of another race into that population, there's absolutely no reason to imagine that they would end up with race-gender parity in mate selection. No reason at all to think that. Nature doesn't do equal. As I said before, even today we have laws regulating mate selection. Some involve people with disabilities, some involve age. And even when there aren't laws, there are norms. For example, marrying someone substantially less intelligent than you, or a 50-year-old marrying a 20-year-old. While these things are not illegal, they are seen as wrong. And in the same vein, when a white male dips into the Asian population because he knows that being white is worth an extra 10 to 20% attractiveness, exploiting this and leaving an Asian male to die alone, does this not seem wrong? Because it seems wrong to me. When I last thought about this issue, I still had a very entrenched libertarian morality in my mind. And as recently as a day ago, I said I was opposed to laws against race mixing, but now I don't. No. I know that mixed marriages are more likely to end up with bad outcomes, that race mixing results in more people dying alone due to the race-gender disparities, and at a visceral gut level it just feels wrong, and I'm not alone in this. In fact, I'm in the majority on this, at least regarding black-white couples on which the visceral reaction research has been done. One thing I say throughout my videos is that I am the one without a race ideology, that it is those who I criticize who are ideological about race. And on this issue, it's particularly clear that this is what's going on. I propose taking race mixing out of the sphere of ideology, where people take as a maxim that it's okay to have these kinds of marriages, and if you say otherwise, well then you're just a bigot of some sort. And I say to instead just analyze it like you analyze anything else, and when you do that, you find yourself seeing the rationale, at least, behind laws prohibiting it, or at the very least, norms which countenance against it.